Here we are at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City, and we can actually see what the lumber that had been cut in the Sierra Nevada and in the Spooner Summit and Tahoe Basin all around this area was used for. They created railroad ties, one of the main products for all of that cutting, as well as building the train cars, fueling the engines, so that this lumber becomes an important part not only of railroading, but also of mining. For the trains would then get the lumber, bring it to Carson City, and Carson City would send it by the Virginia and Truckee Railroad into the Comstock to provide, again, fuel, wood, timber for the Comstock and for mining. So all three industries were intimately connected. And here you see a payroll dating from 1883 showing some of the men who were cutting at Lakeview for the railroad. And here we have a camp that recreates what camp life was probably like for these railroad camps and lumber camps. And you see that they basically have a tent and they have musical instruments, because one of the things that they did for recreation was to play a variety of different musical instruments. One of the interesting things about these Chinese railroad workers and lumbermen was they wore large brim hats to keep the sun away from them, from the back of their necks and from the front. And so we see that that's one of the distinctive outfits that they had. But they normally wore regular Levi jeans and Western boots. And in fact, once they landed in the United States, they ran to the stores to buy the Western boots, because they knew that if they were working in any type of construction or any type of lumbering, that they would definitely need the boots, the heavy boots. One of the things that we found at the various archaeological sites are fragments of this kind of bowl, which is the everyday eating utensil, or part of their utensils in daily life. But what was really interesting is they had fantastic foods, and they differed from the other lumbermen and railroadmen in the sense that they had a lot of fresh foods to eat. For the Central Pacific Railroad guaranteed that every Sunday they would have a fresh killed chicken. And in China, a chicken was a festive meal, or a festive meat. So they had chicken, they had fresh killed pork, they had beef, they had vegetables, some of which were preserved and some of which were grown by the Chinese gardener, as they were called, or Chinese farmers. And so it was very important to be near a source of water so that they could grow these fresh vegetables, which were a main part of their diet. And then this was supplemented by dried fruits and vegetables that came in on the Central Pacific Railroad and was transported and distributed by Chinese merchants throughout Nevada. Over here, we see a photograph of Nong Chung Yi's daughter, Ah Kum Kee, and her granddaughter, Shirlaine Kee Baldwin, was at the site in Verdi. Ah Kum Kee's father was one of the big labor contractors, one of the big men providing goods, merchandise for lumbering, for the lumbermen, whether they were Chinese or non-Chinese, and providing food for many of these workers. The railroad workers then began to settle in various towns, such as Lovelock, Winnemucca, Carlin, Elko. All of these railroad towns become very important in the history of Nevada. What we're looking at here is a reconstruction of a Chinese joss house. And joss is really a Portuguese word for Dios, or God. One of the things that distinguished the Chinese from the larger community, they felt, was the belief in non-Christian ideas. And actually, the Chinese religious beliefs date back to the 4th century BC, when Confucius decided that it was important to have reverence for your ancestors, because these are the people who made you what you are today. And so joss houses were created to remember their ancestors, and you light incense, as you can see, in honor of your ancestors, connecting the past, with the present and with the future. And one of the interesting aspects of this joss house are the artifacts that are there on the altar table. And it is under one of these artifacts that we found the name Yinshan. Yinshan meaning gold, silver mountain. And in California, it was called Gold Mountain or Jinshan. So we know that from a very early date that the Chinese recognized that this was the Silver State. There's an altar in the Nevada State Museum as well, and you can see lots of neat artifacts there in the Chinese historical exhibit just down the street at the State Museum. All of these joss houses could be found in Chinatowns all along the railroad tracks because the railroad owned the land on both sides of the track and often leased them or sold them to the Chinese. And we have documentation that some of the land was sold to the Chinese, and they would want to put a permanent structure that was important to the entire community, and so a joss house would often be built on land that the Chinese bought, and it would be a more permanent and nicer structure than some of the surrounding structures, such as their homes, because of course the houses were just temporary places to live, and because of the 1875 Page Law, they couldn't bring their wives over. The Page Law said that you had to prove that you weren't a prostitute, and how many women could prove that they weren't a prostitute before they could immigrate. So it was just easier to stay in China. And what happened then is you get a predominantly male community in Nevada and throughout the West of Chinese men who weren't good housekeepers, I have to admit, and therefore the home wasn't their center. The joss house, the community center, was really their social center, and that's where they put a lot of their money into. Unfortunately, there are no more joss houses in Nevada. The last one that was destroyed was a beautiful two-story brick building in Winnemucca that was destroyed in the 1950s. And of course there was one in Reno that was also made of brick and destroyed around the same time. The joss houses were destroyed because the Chinese population had dropped to such a low level that there was really no one to take care of these joss houses, and the larger community felt that these were non-Christian sites, and so, boom, they were torn down, no matter how well built they were. Although the Euro-American community didn't like Chinese religion, they really embraced Chinese medicine. And one of the reasons for this, of course, was in the late 19th century, American medicine, or Western medicine, was in its infancy. So throughout the archaeological sites that we've looked at, we have found Chinese medicine bottles. Oftentimes they were mistaken for opium bottles, but now that we have been more sophisticated in our archaeological knowledge, we know that these are medicine bottles. And the general Euro-American community, particularly women, would like to visit the Chinese doctors because they could get comfort from them. One of the reasons why women in the West, who are very few in number, turn to the Chinese doctors for relief for their monthly periods and for childbirth ease and postnatal cures was because Chinese medicine was over 2,000 years old, was effective, and did solve many of their problems. And many of the men went to the Chinese doctors for herbal medicines to solve venereal diseases as well as other problems. Like one man wrote in his diary, the Western doctor wanted to cut off his leg, but the Chinese doctor cured him through herbs and acupuncture or acupressure. We're not quite certain what. And so therefore he saved his leg, and he thought this was wonderful. And this kind of advertisement spread throughout many of these mining, railroad, and lumber communities. And oftentimes the clientele for a Chinese doctor was the larger Euro-American community. So that, for instance, in Eureka, you find in a population of maybe a couple of hundred Chinese, 10 Chinese doctors, because they're serving the larger community.